Singapore, who's been in touch with me. I'm delighted to be invited to participate in CDM's National Seminar 2023 this year on the subject of Emerging Great Power Rivalry, Strategic Imperatives for India. The topic given to me to speak on is, does power flow out of the barrel of the gun? The political and military dimensions of emerging great power rivalry. Obviously, I will be looking at the military and political dimensions of this emerging great power rivalry from the frame of what is given to me as, does power flow out of the barrel of the gun? Now, most of you are familiar that this quote belongs to Chinese leader, Chairman Mao Zedong. He was only 34 years of young man in 1927 when addressing an emergency meeting of the Chinese Communist Party that was set up in 1921. He used this line saying, Chang Kangzi Lian Chu Cheng Chuan, which fundamentally means political power emanates or flows out of the barrel of the gun. So he didn't say power, he said political power flows out of the barrel of the gun to that special emergency meeting of Communist Party on 7th August of 1927. Of course, he was talking about this at the very beginning of a civil war which was emerging in China at that time. But a more substantive articulation of the same point of view was made by Mao when he was 45 years of age in 1938. When he was addressing in middle of the civil war, Kuomintang, the nationalist government and communists had come together to fight against the Japanese. He was addressing then the 6th plenary session of Chinese Communist Party's 6th Central Committee on 6th of November 1938. And that is where he outlined the same understanding of political power flows out of the barrel of the gun in a little more detail. Now, this became more popular only after 1960, when the collective works of Mao were published, and this speech was also published entitled as Problems of War and Strategy. Along with his other essay titled On the Revolutionary War, this was repeatedly cited, debated, and became more popular, that Mao had said that political power emanates from the barrels of gun in that sense. But few things are important for us to understand this frame that I'm using to then talk about political and economic dimensions of the evolving great power rivalry. First one is, as I just mentioned, he's talking of political power and not just power, crudely speaking, of in the sense of destructive power. And important here is to understand that he also underlines why is he saying that. He's saying that it is difficult for the laboring people, for the peasantry, who are, he says, deceived and intimidated by reactionary forces or ruling classes for thousands of years, to feel awakened and aware of the possibilities of holding gun in their own hands. And that is where he is calling upon the communist cadres to come and take the leadership role in awakening the peasantry and working class to, first of all, begin to think that they could actually be holding gun in their own hand and taking the power into their own hands, basically. Because he believes that in absence or in innocence of the real hard military power, no movement can actually achieve anything substantial. And this, he says, partly because he says that the peasantry has to deal with warlords, bourgeois that are always equipped with violent power. But once he has said that one has to use violence to deal with violence, immediately next sentence of this sentence in his speech saying political power emanates from the barrel of the gun, he immediately says our principle is that the party must command the gun and gun must never be allowed to command the party. Now that's very significant, and he wants to ensure what in Western discourses we say civilian control on military power, which then, of course, ensures economy of power in how we use the power that the gun produces in that sense. Now, second very important thing other than this, he says Russian guns have produced a communist party and that has created a Soviet state. But he says that our mission will be to create a democratic republic. Now, Mao is talking of this in 1927 and 38, that he wants to create a democratic state. In fact, Xi Jinping, in his 19th party speech, which brought him to limelight in terms of his centennial goals for Chinese, talks of same thing. By 2049, he wants to make China into a beautiful, advanced, and a democratic state. So here, Mao is very conscious of putting it in perspective as to where he places gun and where he places the power that flows out of it and what is the objective that he wants to use that power for. Now, he also talks of how experience of class struggle in an imperialism, in era of imperialism, as he says, teaches us very clearly that working classes and laboring classes will have to use violence, will have to use gun to deal with armed bourgeois and landlords. But then he says that this power will be used to transform the world. But at end of that transformation, he says we want to advocate abolition of war. He says we don't want war and we want to abolish war. Guns will be used only to get rid of guns, as he says. So that is the frame we are using, where the power that emanates from the gun is political power. There is a clear objective as to what that power is supposed to be used for. And of course, that the primary use of that power will be to demolish violent imperialist bourgeois and landlords, warlords, and set up a democratic state, possibly at end of that movement. Now, that is the frame we are using to understand in contemporary world order how are military and political dimensions evolving in creating what we call great power rivalry, and how does that impact upon the rest of the world. Very clearly, emphasis here is on rivalry or evolving rivalry of great powers, which means rivalry also exists among all other actors. For example, you could have cases of rivalry between Libya and Eritrea, or Benin and Burkina Faso. That's not what we are discussing. We are discussing rivalry of great powers. And that indeed the outline that is given to all of us as to what this particular panel or session has to focus on clearly defines. But the whole idea of great power had emerged, during the Napoleonic Wars. At end of Napoleonic Wars, we had Treaty of Westphalia. That's the time we understood what great powers were, powers that could influence the system. And of course, then after nuclear revolution, we also spoke of superpowers. Now, it's only the rivalry of those great powers, and we could have a different list of what are the countries that can be defined as great powers. India is often seen as on the cusp of being a great power, or sometimes called a reluctant great power. So that definition could vary, but understanding is that powers that have system shaping capabilities in international system, their rivalry is significant because that influences not only their everyday life, but everyday life of rest of the world as well. Now, rivalry debates have become very popular, particularly in developed Western world. But remember, even Xi Jinping of China talks about reorganization of great power relations. So fundamentally, great powers not only have rivalry, but they are also molding, evolving the narratives around what those rivalries are, how are they being shaped, and how they will really pan out and what potentially will come out of that exercise. Now, for example, much of the West today defines China as a competitor with system shaping capabilities potentially. Russia is often called an adversary instead. They define in terms of rivalry, either as competition or as adversarial relationship. But the axis around which that rivalry is sought to be built between so-called industrialized developed countries of the West and Russia and China and some of their friends and allies on the other, that axis around which that rivalry, if one has to simplify, is built around the binary of autocracy and democracy. If you remember, for the last 100 years of international relations, uh, most of these developed Western nations have been working to promote democracy. In fact, both world wars, World War I and World War II, were fought to establish democratic systems, democratic values. Indeed, since Second World War, United States, other than few years, have been constantly on war in one part or the other part of the world. Invariably, those wars are meant to either protect a democracy or establish a democracy. So that means rivalry is being built around this idea of fighting autocracies and building democracies. Now, has that rivalry moved in a direction where use of power flowing from the barrel of the gun, I'm talking here of destructive power and political power as well, has it resulted in expansion of democracies? One of the most famous source of deciding expansion or shrinking of democracies around the world is an NGO in the United States called Freedom House. All of you are familiar with that. Now, that NGO was set up, international NGO was set up in 1973, and it has been doing an extensive work in measuring the level of human rights observance, civil liberties observance around the world. So, for example, if you look at their report for 2023 called Freedom in the World Report for 2023, they have collected extensive data for 195 nation states and 15 territories, which are not called nation states as of now. So together, they have collected data for 210 nation states and territories. And according to their own definition, the most basic elementary qualification to be called democracy is electoral democracy, which is able to hold elections. And they, in their recent report, come to the conclusion that out of 210, 116 countries are having electoral democracies. But of course, they also then understand that democracies have a whole spectrum of shades and shades and shades. So we talk about proletarian democracy, authoritarian democracy, majoritarian democracy, procedural democracy, electoral democracy, of course, and the liberal democracy, which is epitome of the imagination of what ideally democracy should be, has shrunk to no more than 13% of democracies, nations that are having liberal democracy today. So according to them, about 20% of the global population lives today in those free countries, as they call. And they also come to conclusion that in last 20 years, authoritarianism or autocracy, as they call it, has been on the rise, and democracy, according to them, has declined. Now, that means from this most significant, respected source of Western debates on great power rivalry around promoting democracy and dealing with autocracies, this has been a bit of a failure in that sense. And that means great power rivalry has moved in favor of authoritarian or autocratic states. But what is interesting here is to understand that within those democracies that we discussed, the total liberal democracies where each human being is given civil liberties, individualism respected, is constantly under question, because compared to autocracies, for example, they say where elites are often formed around very narrow number of individuals, very rigidly defined. They could be elites by birth. They could be very parochial, conservative in their mindset. Elites in democracies, according to them, are relatively normative. They are dynamic. They are much more porous. That means there is a possibility of entry and exit. Nevertheless, even in democracies, there are elites that are governing and controlling the power, the political power, or power that flows out of the barrel of the gun. Then. So there is even a question that democracy perhaps is a weak system. It's a porous system. Democracies allow external actors to intervene and influence the dynamics of internal politics of a state. Whereas black boxes like authoritarian states, it's not easy to intervene and influence their internal narratives. So in some sense, when we talk of pure political power, perhaps there is need to disconnect from the political system or the nature of politics within that particular nation state and how the power that, of course, emanates from gun is how it is wielded, how it is channelized. That then begins to have a limited connect between the nature of politics or political system and the power or political power that a gun can emanate for a particular nation state to deliver whatever its national objectives are. Now, that means that when we want to measure evolving rivalry of great powers, it perhaps has limited relevance to then categorize them as authoritarian or democratic. Because both of them will have their own advantages and disadvantages of how to cultivate the power and how to utilize that power, channelize the power that, as we said, flows out of barrel of gun. Now let's look at the military dimension, the barrel of the gun now. Military dimension, the easiest way to measure the quantum of power that flows out of the barrel of gun in military perspective would be two ways. One, looking at how much money is being invested, and second, how much manpower is engaged. So, economic resource and human resource. Now, if you look at this, then very clearly China, United States, and India would be three great powers one should bother about, one should be worried about. Why? Because United States, this year's budget, defense budget, is $858 billion, almost reaching $1 trillion. Next to that is China with $230 billion, and India's budget this year, defense budget this year, is $72.6 billion. Of course, so if you look at United States defense budget, it is larger than the 10 next largest defense budgets combined. That's one way of looking at it in terms of current dollar terms. But then experts also look at in terms of their purchasing power parity. What is the punch that each penny in case of India or China would have will be higher if you measure them in terms of dollars. Likewise, if you look at the growth rates in these economies, for example, 1.8% growth rate in the United States, 4.2% growth rates going on in China now, or maybe up to 5, to 7 to 8% growth rate in GDP of India. That means the potential of this budget going up over a longer period of time will give you a different estimation of how this capacity to generate power from the barrel of the gun would evolve in coming times. Likewise, in manpower, United States today has 1.39 million soldiers in uniform. China has much bigger armed forces, 2 million. India has slightly less, 1.38 million. But if you remember, North Korea has 1.2 million also. Now, the potency of each of these soldiers sustainability of their morality, their morale, their skill power is different. Now, that would depend on what kind of technology is made available to them. What is the ratio of soldier per thousand citizens in the nation? Likewise, in military, for example, we talk about tooth to tail ratio. If you extend that argument to military versus society, that means how much of society is supporting each soldier in that sense, then India would clearly not just have democratic, but also demographic advantage. India also has volunteer force, for example. So in that sense, how much quantity, what is the nature of that quantity of the power which is produced by the gun will be really subject to lot of interpretations, even if we look at three great powers, United States, China, and India, in terms of their total defense potency. Now we go to the next step of how this power flowing from the gun is converted into political power, because you all understand, scholars like Joseph Nye, for example, from Harvard, have given us a whole set of a spectrum of new concepts: hard power to soft power to smart power to sharp power. So, in that sense, of course, hardcore military power remains the backbone of all these other avatars of power, but these can make efficacy of hard power much more potent, much more legitimate, much more acceptable in bringing influence, compliance to the power that is wielding it. So, in that sense, what Mao said in terms of political power flows out of the barrel of the gun, and in what 2023 presents in front of us, how and what kind of political power can flow out of that barrel of the gun is very different. In fact, the men who wield that gun are also no longer the same. It's not only the standing, recognized, organized, authorized state forces that are holding weapons in war today. Most of you would remember that in Persian Gulf War, for example, Western forces at one point in time were supported by 180,000 personnel from private security companies. Now, these are private registered companies that work for profit, and they don't have this reason that the standing armies have in terms of the flag being the symbol, nationalism, patriotism being the reason. And now, of course, Ukraine war has created a whole new genre of volunteers who don't need any authorization or even authentication by their respective states. They could just come there as volunteers. Both Russia and Ukraine has sent out calls for people to join and offer them citizenship if they fight for them. So here we are talking of veterans, sharpshooters, volunteers who are able to join wars, and that is creating a whole new genre of instrumentality of gun. In fact, technology has also transformed how even the destructive power is wielded and utilized. We today have drone flyers who are sitting in faraway countries, controlling drones in United States and attacking people in Afghanistan. You also have propagandists. You have information warriors. You have cyber warriors. You have a whole lot of other technologies of artificial intelligence. You have semiconductors. So what I'm saying is that enormous interdependence, enormous intertwining even among adversaries. Countries that are actually not just in soft balancing each other, but hard balancing using, sort of eyeball to eyeball deployments against each other. They are also enormously interdependent on each other at the same time. So that really puts enormous restraint on use of hard power and makes it important to transform that hard power into smart power or soft power if possible. That really puts enormous restraints on countries. In fact, I'm sure you heard before me Shiv Shankar Menon His article this week in Foreign Affairs, it's titled Out of Alignment, is fundamentally arguing how the recent trends have shown that the power of all great powers have virtually diminished over a period of. He is talking of shift from non-alignment to unalignment, which is where several other powers, particularly middle powers, are beginning to fend for themselves. In that sense, the very idea of great power rivalry is coming under question, whether that is going to have as much of system shaking potential as we have assumed traditionally in international relations theory. So, rivalry is now facing a challenge of what, again, to quote Joseph Nye, is diffusion of power. Diffusion of power between actors, where you don't have only the standing armies, but even private players, volunteers wielding those weapons and using those weapons in the name of state, fighting for the state, or you have diffusion of power from state to civil society, media, whole lot of other actors and factors. That is perhaps making state also far more constrained, and so also the armed forces of the state far more constrained in wielding and utilizing hard power, though that remains the backbone of all political power, but increasingly need for using of soft power ideally, but smart power if possible. That's why even armed forces today are spending much more efforts on military diplomacy, military exercises, military exchanges, power projections, HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercises. So it's a very different kind of power which is being today generated by the gun. Completely different compared to how Mao would have conceived of almost 95 years back, 1927, when he was thinking of making this argument of power flows out of the barrel of the gun. And therefore, I think that frame has very limited relevance to understand the nature of evolving rivalry of great powers in 21st century. Just as I said, that perhaps the evolving great power rivalry of 21st century perhaps does not have as much system shaping or system shaking capabilities as it may have had 100 years before, because of diffusion of power and increased interdependence and interconnection of people. People to people connections have transformed completely in terms of flow of informations and flow of capital. And that is completely changing how that great power rivalry is evolving, what are the elements and contours of it, and how potentially it could even impact. So two things to close my presentation. One, what Mao conceived of as power flowing out of the barrel of the gun in 1927 has limited relevance to understand the evolving great power rivalry in 21st century, in 2023. Second, that the potency of great power rivalry in transforming, impacting upon the international system, impacting even the smallest, faraway, remote, small, obscure state or people has also become limited. And I think increasingly there is a autonomy of multiple actors that can kind of stay alienated and insulated from great power rivalry that we talk of. Of course, it is not to say that great power rivalry has no impact on international system. It does have impact on the international system, but perhaps we will have to wait and watch how middle powers evolve as another genre. We have seen impact of great powers in 19th and early 20th century. We saw impact of superpower rivalry in the second half of 20th century. 21st century might provide an opportunity for middle powers to transform the discourse as to A, what is meant by Great Powers Rivalry, how it is conducted, and how much impact it can have in transforming international system. I hope I made some sense in my presentation to you. I am again thankful to the College of Defense Management to allow me this space to be part of this great gathering of experts on the subject.
We shall now adjourn for a refreshment break. May I request you all to join back at 16:05 hours. Thank you.